Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out here in the direction of Sinkivka to the north, where the Russians have launched another attack here to the north, where they are attempting to infiltrate Sinkivka from this northern direction, expanding their zone of control and attempting to expand their foothold within the village of Sinkivka. The Ukrainians still have positions here to the east of the village, which made it difficult for the Russians to advance, but with this geolocated footage we see that the Ukrainians launched a counterattack towards these Russian advances. The Ukrainian counterattack allowed them to fight and push the Russians out of the eastern parts of Sinkivka with armored assaults, and with this the Russians are now holding positions here to the northern forest patches, to the northeast of Sinkivka, and in the northwestern parts of the village, as they launched attacks from within the forest areas here to the west of Sinkivka, and with that they still hold positions within Sinkivka despite the Ukrainian counterattack. So the Russians are attempting to attack from the northeast and northwest, while the Ukrainians are counterattacking, trying to push them out of the village with some of these units that they are using for active defense. They're more elite units with armored vehicles. We then move on in a southern direction towards the village of Avdiivka to the west of Bakhmut. Here there are reports that the Russians have extended their offensive operations from the forest patches to the north and have managed to cut the road here to the west of Avdiivka. Also reports of them expanding their assault from the east into the village and capturing multiple roads. However, I'm waiting further confirmation of these reports and also waiting for geolocated confirmation. Until then, I'm just keeping it as a gray zone, as the Russians are very close to these positions, so it's very likely that they have happened. But until I get further confirmation, I will not report it as Russian territory yet. Moving further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have significant developments here. The Russians yesterday gave an ultimatum to the Ukrainians defending the city, saying that they had until the specific time point to surrender. If not, they will start or restart their offensive operations and capture the city. That time went by. Not a lot of Ukrainians surrendered. The majority kept defending the city. Therefore, new operations have started, and the Russians are attacking to the northwest of the city, getting a foothold within the Dacha area to the east of the coke plant. Here to the south of the city, there are attacks in both directions of this enclave. The Ukrainians held to the southern outskirts of the city. They're also attacking in both sides of the Sarkohota direction towards the fortifications of the Dacha area and the military base to the southwest of the city. At the same time, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to defend the final supply road in and out of Avdiivka, where they managed to push the Russians back from the direction of Severne. But this is why this attack from the north by the Russians is significant, because this means that the Russians are now launching an operation to cut off the supply road in and out of Avdiivka from the northern direction. With a foothold in the forest line here to the northwest of the citadel area, the Russians could physically cut off the road here between Avdiivka and Severne and physically cut the final supply line in and out of the city, and therefore fully encircle the city of Avdiivka. The fighting right now is centered around these four areas. The southern part of Avdiivka, which encompasses both the southern outskirts of the city and the military base, as well as Dacha area to the south of the citadel area. Then we have the northwestern parts, which is centered around the supply road in and out of Avdiivka. The northern parts about the coke plant, where we see this footage here. First off, we have this drone footage, which shows the whole coke plant from an above view in black and white. And with this footage here, we see that the Russians have drones very close to the coke plant and have an aerial overview of the coke plant. This means that they can create a plan of action towards storming the coke plant and getting control of it. So you're likely seeing that the developments in the Dacha area to the northeast of Avdiivka is likely in preparation for storming the coke plant. The Russians here have an interest in getting control over the coke plant to the northwest of the city, which would allow them to pretty much get a very strong hold over the northern parts of the city, solidifying their control, allowing them to use the supply routes by the railways to resupply the area, so the Russians could extend the Battle of Avdiivka for a long time if they hold the coke plant. The coke plant itself is, however, very difficult to deal with. If the Russians were to storm it, they would have a very difficult time taking control of it if the Ukrainians have some proper positions within it. Also, there's likely underground areas which the Russians would have to go through, which would require face-to-face firing of the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers. However, we did see from the Bakhmut direction, the steel plant here to the north of the city was stormed by Wagner forces very quickly. The Russians managed to get control of it fairly quickly. And with the experience from there, the Russians may be able to repeat the same success in the coke plant. So with that, we see that the Russians may develop their offensive further here in the northern direction. But then there's also the focus here in a southern direction towards the train station in the center of the city. There's also the stationed areas where we've seen a lot of fighting taking place. As for the western parts, there's going to be more fighting towards Lastrishkine in the western direction, as well as in the southern direction to cut off the main supply route in and out of Avdiivka and the final supply route in and out of Avdiivka. As for the southern parts, it is clear that the Russians are here attempting to cut off the Ukrainian soldiers to the southwest of the city by attacking the flanks of it. And with this, we are looking at a connection between the Russians from the east and the west of the Dacha area. They've captured about a third of it. And with this, the Russians would be in a situation where they can cut off the whole northern parts of it, which would mean that the southern parts would be completely encircled by the Russians, and they would either have to surrender or keep fighting till the last man. And that is not a good situation to be in a conflict. We then see in the eastern parts where the Russians have launched attacks both in the eastern direction from the Sadka Huta area, as well as in the western direction from the industrial area of Avdiivka, where the Russians will look to have the tips touch between the eastern and western parts. And with this, we see that the Russians will likely look to launch attacks in the northern direction, where they will continue covering the parts of the residential area that are on the high grounds here to the southeast and move towards the cemetery area. There are also reports of fighting in the northeastern direction, reaching all the way to the cemetery area here to the east of Avdiivka, which would mean that the Russians have control over the heights here. But yet again, I'm waiting for further confirmation. It seems that the reports here are getting ahead of themselves. There may be something that is reported that hasn't happened yet, but then there's also always the possibility that it has happened yet. We're seeing constant advances by the Russians every day, and it's very difficult to get an overview over all the developments that have happened, especially with the very limited information and the late information we get from the soldiers fighting at the front line. But what we are seeing is that the end game of Avdiivka is definitely here, and it is speeding up with the end of the deadline of the Russian ultimatum. And with this, we see that the Russians are pushing from all sides, both from the south in both directions of the southwest and the southeast, the northern directions towards the supply line, in the Dacha area to the very north, where the Russians are looking to expand their supply route in and out of the city and create a front line by the coke plant, isolating it from the rest of the city further than that it already is, as well as operations in the southern direction towards the train station in the center, further operations in towards the direction of the citadel area, and in the eastern direction to cut off the Ukrainians fighting in the Dacha area to the very furthest eastern parts of the city, with additional Ukrainian reinforcements, including Azov brigades, being sent to this section where there are some soldiers who have proven that they very rarely decide to surrender. It could also be that they are sent to the coke plant area to make a repeat of the Mariupol situation, where 10,000 or somewhere around that Ukrainian soldiers were said to be encircled at the start of the war. In the end, we didn't get proper numbers on how many were captured, but we do know that some top commanders were captured at that point. This is unlikely to happen today because their commanders are in the back line, but what we do see is that the Ukrainians will likely try to hold the coke plant and the citadel area as the main parts. They will also hold the flank to protect their supply line. This is why it's very interesting that the Russians actually managed to push further westwards into the forest lines, which could end all of the operations by the Ukrainians within the city by cutting off the main supply line. So we have to take our look out for that here to the northwest of the citadel area. And the most important parts will be how long it takes for the Russians to consolidate their gains here to the south, completely cutting off both of these salients by the Ukrainians, and then pushing further northwards towards the citadel area itself. If the Russians capture the citadel area, then forget about the supply road. There is no chance that the Ukrainians get any reinforcements into the city or any of their soldiers out of it. Moving further south in the direction of the Pobjeda direction, we see here that the Russians managed to advance here in the direction of Pobjeda by expanding the zone of control to the south east of the village, and with this the Russians have full control over the first line here to the east of it. This means that the Russians can now launch attacks towards Pobeda itself, storming the village with the positions nearby, and with this the Russians are in a position where they can capture the village if they launch a strong enough attack, and depending on how well the Ukrainians are able to defend it. But what we do see is that the Russians are generally advancing throughout the front line, except for the Zaporizhia front, where we're seeing that there are developments day by day as the Russians continue pressing on. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.